this is where I want to go into the political context of this. And first of all, I'm very aware from now on in another sense, I'm doing what I am objecting to. I'm actually going to offer you some ideas of where I think we are, in order that not that you're closed down, but it hopefully stimulates you to think, well, to what extent does that seem right to me or not? Because that is the process we have to engage in together here, is how do we find a process within which we can begin to see each other? Because I suppose for me now, this is not an amoral enterprise, it's your ethical question. And the fundamentally difficult ethical question is, for me, I will say, all of this is predicated for me, is how in the face of inhumanity is humanity regenerated? It's actually it's very broad and general, but that is the fundamental ethical question. And it is also, once you start talking about humanity in those kind of words, you're starting to talk about a whole series of unbelievably complex realities for people which are being negotiated. But that has something to do with the recognition of the other. And some fundamental principle, which was best formulated for me in that in humanistic education, which is that every human person counts, which is that you can't get away from that. You cannot get away from the counting of everyone. And that was Donald Shriver's formulation of it, and it still resonates with me. But anyway, and we come in the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, to a point, a really complicated question, which is, if it is rational not to trust, how do we trust? If it is rational, if history teaches us that it's perfectly rational not to trust, how do we trust, and why should we trust? What is that about? Because that is that's why it's so hard. It's not hard because the really interesting thing about living here is it's not hard because of the information we don't know. It's hard because of what the information takes us to, which is very often the information takes us back to we shouldn't trust each other, or we can't trust each other. And yet we know already that we're in this predicament, which is the future depends on us trusting. And I think our impasse, our current impasse, is and what's called ambivalence, is between those 2 points. It is between the point which is the future depends on us learning to trust, and safety depends on us maintaining our mistrust. And between those 2 points, we kind of oscillate all the time between those two positions at the moment, and actually that leaves people almost in deep, profound confusion about how we're going to go forward. Okay, let me just talk very, very quickly about my understanding of some of this historic about where we're going. I think my key words here are seeing, authority, and trust, and I think that's where I want to take us to. History here, and I think just because of your ethical remembering project, I root it there, because we can go back obviously to the originary violence, if you like. You know, where was the originary violence? Where did this start off? And that is an interesting question, because originary means usually you are responsible. So that's why we drive it back. History becomes a process of driving back the facts to find who you can blame in the present. And if that's what it is, most people are and when you talked about the Protestant community not liking it anymore, that's because they feel very, very quickly that they're getting to the point where that is them. And they're not stupid. And they're probably right. That is where left-wing history takes you, because the consequence of that is that you say, well, the original act was the colonial act, and therefore the colonial act goes back to you. That's it. So, although actually the fact that we all lived off the colonial act then gets a bit hidden under that, but never mind. But let me just say a few things. Go back, use this one, and if anybody wants to then say, if you reconfigure the what do you see, because you started at a different point, and I'm happy enough to do that. But about 100 years ago, your 100-year project, essentially, in 1912, the Unionist population bought an idea, which was that their circumstances legitimated them using all means necessary. In other words, there is a circumstance in which violence is not crime, it's heroism. And that's deeply embedded, actually, in probably all human culture, actually. So we're talking about some things which are really profound. But at a political, cultural level in 1912, so 100 years ago, the Unionist population explicitly said that there are circumstances in which we can, this is no longer crime. That and that's true. 4 years later, Patrick Pearse says it's not war that's evil, it's the things that cause war that are evil. And he gets basically the same point. He essentially comes to the same point, which is there are certain things in which killing people is the sacrificial and being killed as a result, in his case, is, as he says, is the you need to show people the violence in order for them to rise up and see what it is. So it's his sacrificial mode. That's Pearse's mode. And essentially that becomes the foundation myth of the Irish Republic. The entire nationalist Ireland, not just republicanism, nationalist Ireland is founded on the story that this was the great breakthrough. Now, you can discuss whether it was, and it's a political discussion about whether it was or not. But the bottom line was that violence was a virtue. And we live in communities, we have to be extremely clear that we live in communities which, and they draw, by the way, on hundreds of years of other things, so I'm not going to start them there, I'm simply using that as your ethical remembering point. From that we live in the shadow of events which shaped very much the political circumstances and constellations of Ireland, north and south, in which we have to be very clear that across the broad mass of this population, we decided that violence was a virtue under certain circumstances. And therefore, to say that violence is not a virtue, violence is a problem, is to revisit the stories we've told ourselves and tell ourselves and probably feel ourselves, if we push it far enough, that we've lived off. And we have to be very, very clear that the majority of people who've grasped to violence in our generation and in the previous generations here do so calling on that. That they haven't done it because they thought they were particularly bad people. And that's a bit of an insight. That the people who killed mostly believe that what they were doing was loyalty and heroism in the face of those two imperatives. And actually, therefore, to face history and ourselves means to face ourselves in the light of this. It also means that even if we did not tie to a gun, even if we believe their acts are violence, in as far as we promulgated these stories, we're part of another story. We're part of a story. We're part of a story which essentially, and it's funny that I was on the Sentence Review Commission. I still, I've had to stand down now because of the politics, but what's really, Sentence Review Commission is this hidden part of our truth-telling process, which is really hysterical. That it was massively controversial at the time of the referendum and has disappeared from most people's view. And I think it's by far the most comprehensive and interesting thing which happened because it was never reported on. It was so successful. Basically, we were the early release program for the paramilitaries. So the big difference there is you have all the court records. Everything's in public. And if you've done what I had to do, which was read all the cases as part of the... you're not in any doubt about what happened. So I'm living in a different world, I think, to most people, which is there's no shock involved here. And I have to tell you, it's pretty horrific. And what counts as heroism turns into something that Hannah Arendt would describe as the banality of evil. That they are a series of people doing a series of acts, none of which look particularly heroic when you strip them back. They look like pretty close to murder, really. And that's when you tell them in a court. They look like murder. And that's on all sides. Now, obviously, the issue of the state and its involvement in that, and we'll have to talk about that, is not there. But the issue of the specific killings of individuals are recorded in detail. And that process also showed me that the people who did it were overwhelmingly boys between the ages of 16 and 25 from social classes C, D and E. That's who did it. And you are actually driven to one of two conclusions. Either you believe those people are particularly prone to evil, or you believe that something was happening in this society that was picked up by a particular group of people who are normally the infantry in every war, as far as I can see, as heroic. And so what actually on the page looks like people hitting people over the head with a breeze block was for them an act of heroism. Killing somebody who they discovered was Catholic because he was eating a pizza is justified as all means necessary. What Billy Hutchison said and shocked everybody this week is essentially we were acting in the line of this. All means necessary. It's no different. We are of a piece with what you have said all along. And actually, in the end, Gerry Adams says Jean McConville had to go because of violence. Well, we got it wrong in that case, perhaps, but there you go. It's part of what happens in war. And so the process of unpicking history will implicate us all. Will implicate us all.